can only imagine when that day comes.
Well, we have awakened on a beautiful day, haven't we? Let's have a prayer as we begin. Lord, we're thankful for this new day. We're thankful for the beauty of it. And we're grateful for the rains that have come and replenished the land. We pray now that as we enter into this period of study, that you would bless our study. We're thankful for your servant David and for the way his heart was always tuned towards spiritual things. And that whenever he made mistakes or brazen errors on a few occasions, that he did not hesitate and did not equivocate, but he turned from it and returned to his first love. Give us such a heart. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In Psalm 18, it's the longest psalm in what is called Book 1. It's about the first 50 or so psalms. The Jewish people organized it. Psalm, I think it's 1, 2, 3. It's the longest there, and it is a psalm of just effusive praise, but David just praising God. And so it doesn't follow any formal, highly structured arrangement. It's just, this is just rolling out of David. And he comes in Psalm 18, we'd gotten to verses 30 through 36 kind of as a unit, where he's talking about what God's done for him. And he says, as for God, his way is blameless. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? The God who girds me with strength and makes my way blameless. He makes my feet like a hind's feet, and he sets me upon high places. He trains my hands for battle, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have also given me a shield of your salvation, and your right hand upholds me, and your gentleness makes me great. You enlarge my steps under me, and my feet have not slipped. Just there at the end, we don't think about that as much, but where you had soldiers, they're not standing off with long-range sniper rifles. They're meeting one another toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose on the field of battle. And so it's just very highly important that you not lose your footing, that you don't slip. In fact, the Romans, and that sandal you've seen, they'd always come up to about the knee with it, weaving the leather around. But those things had hobnails in them and kind of like cleats in order to help them maintain their balance. Because if you lost your balance, you're going to lose your life. And so he's talking about the way God has empowered him. And we went through several of those. I didn't want to redo all of that. We come down to verse 34 is where I was. After God had given him firm, effective footing among his enemies and placed David in higher places. He doesn't give any credit to David, does he? He's not silly enough to think, well, I'm just sort of got it going on around here, and I'm this and I'm all that. He recognized that he was elevated to the position that he was in because of God's grace and God's mercy. And fortunate for David, he's thankful that he put him out of reach of those that sought his life. And you recall that David spent a number of years running and eventually launched a guerrilla type of movement, but trying to get away from Saul, who was insanely jealous of him. He's a paranoid guy, and it just ran him nuts. And so David's thankful. He said God has made him to walk without slipping or falling, even in their midst. It's one thing to walk with a sure foot when it's smooth ground, but when you're out there in the conflict, that's when it really counts. Verse 34, God has further assisted David, he says, by training his hands for battle. David was the man I would have hated to run up on and have to engage. Just think about, I think the last time we were together, I mentioned it when he was what's called a ruddy-faced boy. His kid comes out and faces a 9.5-foot tall giant that's a professional soldier all the days of his life. And so he knows the ways of battle. And he's no doubt vanquished many adversaries. When he comes out, the Philistines put their top tough guy out there. They didn't put out the third string or the second string. They put out the guy that was just, as I would describe it, bad to the bone, challenging. And David overcame him. And he was confident that he would overcome him because he'd overcome a bear and a lion. And I guess if you've done that, I think about the American grizzly, what a fierce creature he can be. And if you can face something like that, I don't guess there's many things else in the world that ought to shake you too much. David was not shakeable. And so he said, God trained me for that. He prepared him to face any opposition. The New American Standard says that his arms could bend or break a bow of bronze, that he could confront any foes when he had to. Well, this Hebrew sentence is a little bit difficult to translate. Various translations of it have been offered. Bows, of course, were not made of bronze. I think clearly it's a poetic exaggeration. He was a real strong man. The bows were actually made of wood, and a strong man could break it. The bronze was even stronger. And so he's just saying he made me powerful and equipped me for the life I had to live. And he may be referring to strengthening the arrows. They did have the technology to bronze tip arrows, and you realize that with a metal tip on it, it's going to be more capable of penetrating a target more effectively. And so his arms were made more deadly in battle. And because back then the leaders were not way back. Pamela's dad one time was kidding around, and he said when they were in North Africa, the Germans hit them so hard, he said, I didn't even know where my company was. I just run in another direction because I knew where the Germans were coming from, and I'm going the other way. And he said, we ran so far and so fast past a general or two. And I think that was exaggeration, but typically you put the top guys at the back because they know about strategy and what have you. I'm not necessarily criticizing that, our way of making war, but back then, where did the leader go? In the lead. That's exactly right. If he wasn't willing to go up there, they're not going. David's men would follow him anywhere, period. I mean, without question. He had some loyal people around him, and God provided those people, no doubt. And so he's a deadly man in battle, and God has done that for him. And if he's referring to the bow itself rather than to the arrow, he could be just alluding to the amazing strength of the bow, and much stronger, he's asserting, than the ordinary one. He could use it. He could deal with it. Verse 35, the saving love of God is acknowledged by David there. And notice where he says, you have also given me the shield of your salvation. The powerful hand of God acted and as an encircling protection for him. Now, does the powerful hand of God act in the world today? I know he's not performing signs, wonders, and miracles. Already did that. But is that to say that he's not doing anything now? That's right. And if we don't believe he does anything, then why would we pray? So God in his providence, and I don't understand how providence works, and I'm going to let y'all in on a secret. Don't tell nobody. Nobody else does either. But the Bible teaches it, that God is active in the world, that he cares about his people. And so we need to pray in faith and trust him. And that's what he asks you. Can you trust me in every circumstance? And there's some difficult circumstances that if you live very long, you will face in life. They're just, I'm sorry, but that's the way a broken world is. And so he's acknowledged this love of God and his powerful hand. He doesn't need to worry because God, the invincible God, is his shield. And your he said, your right hand upholds me. God's strong hand sustains him, makes him stand straight. He has behind him the omnipotence of God. What did Paul say? If God be for us, what? Who can be against us? And so God sometimes, in his good providence, provides a way to escape. Sometimes he provides the way to escape through the opposition. You know, if historical tradition is correct, they at some point took Paul out and beheaded him. And so he took one step into the presence of the Lord. And it's not that God abandoned him, and he knew that, and he understood that. He just knew that what he was going to do was serve God. David's the same kind of man. Whatever he's going to do, he's going to be standing for what's right. He's going to be standing up and speaking out for what God would uphold. He said, you uphold me, God's hand sustains me, and he's got this omnipotence behind him. And he adds this, your gentleness makes me great. He preferred to be a gentleman. You know, we talk about what a great warrior he was, and he was. But if you follow his career, he also was compassionate and tenderhearted. I mean, he writes some of these Psalms the way we'd say where I grew up, a jerk a tear out of a glass eye, if you understand what he's saying. I mean, he was capable of that kind of thing. If you'll find out, if you ever have a chance to be around very many professional warriors, that a lot of them are like that. And so David is that man. And he said, your gentleness makes me great, because it's in humiliation that God would condescend to come down to man's level and show his gentleness to him, his condescension to him. God has made David great by giving him victories, putting him on the throne, giving him the respect of the nation. I mean, just think about it. Now, you have this kid that the old man of God, the old prophet, comes out and anoints as king. I mean, he's the little brother of a large family numerically, but they're not prominent. They're not from the elite classes. But that's who God wanted, because God didn't look at the other. You know, when he let the people decide, who'd they get? Saul, didn't they? Big, good-looking, dynamic individual. And he wasn't the man for the job. He was not up to the job. So God chooses a kid. And I can imagine hearing some of the discussions that went on. Notwithstanding the fact that the kid could best a bear and best a lion in battle and ultimately best a giant professional soldier on the field of battle and in combat. Well, it would have been hand-to-hand, except for that sling David had. And so God's done these things for him, and he recognizes God put him on the throne because there was nothing about his situation. It wasn't what he did. And do you think we all ought to maybe give praise and thanks to God for the positive things that happened? I was talking just this past week, I think with my son-in-law, there was one year I ran out of money going to school. I was low emotionally. Best thing ever happened to me. Best thing that ever happened to me. Because I spent that year doing day work, but I got to hang around with the preacher that was there. We got to be really good friends. And then he helped me get into Freed Hardeman, and on and on and on it goes. But what looked bad to me on the surface turned out to be very positive. And so what's the moral of that? Trust God. Trust God. Try to do what's right. Verse 36, God's given him room to move. He said, you enlarge my steps under me. He's not been cramped. He's been sure-footed. His feet have not slipped. God has prevented him from making too tragic of mistakes at this point in his career. In verses 37 through 48, he thanks God for his victories. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. I scattered them so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you have girded me with strength for battle. You have subdued under me those who rose up against me. You have also made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed those who hated me. They cried for help, but there was none to save, even to the Lord. But he did not answer them. Then I beat them fine as the dust before the wind. I emptied them out as the mire of the streets. You have delivered me from the contentions of the people. You have placed me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. As soon as they hear, they obey. Foreigners submit to me. Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock. Blessed be my rock. And exalted be the God of my salvation. The God who executes vengeance for me and subdues peoples under me. He delivers me from my enemies. Surely you lift me above those who rise up against me, and you rescue me from the violent man. And so we have here God working with Israel and his chosen leader of Israel. And David never comes to the point where I did that. Look at what I did. He doesn't allow himself to go there. So that would be the temptation, wouldn't it? Yeah, we look at people, or I do, professional athletes sometimes, some of them great people, but then some of them get to where they're full of themselves. And usually that starts a downward trend because they forget where those skills and talents and what have you came from. Same thing in the entertainment industry and in among the elite classes of people. And so there is that temptation to take credit for what God has placed in your hands, placed before you, put at your disposal. And we want not to go there. We don't want to be that person. We'll be like David on that. And he becomes more specific about his victories. He remembers, I pursued my enemies and overtook them. If you walked out on the field of battle and challenged him, it was on. And there wasn't any time out or any of that. These enemies were unequivocally routed. His claim is this: I did not turn back until they were consumed. And so when he took a war council and decided to make war, it was the real thing. God did not permit the battle to end until David had brought about a decisive victory. Now, why would the Lord get involved in that? Well, because he's given this land. Who did he make a promise to about giving this land to his descendants? Abraham, wasn't it? And so God's going to fulfill his word. He's going to do what he said he would do. David's his man. And he is taking care of business is the way I would describe that. And verse 38, his victory was so complete that he can say, I shattered them so they were not able to rise. When he got through, the battle was over. The defeated enemy lay before him. As he said, they fell under my feet. And there on the ground, they had been humiliated and rendered powerless before the might of God's army. Verse 39, what God has done here provides a basis for David to express this praise that he has for the Lord. You have girded me with strength for battle. God has supplied the strength and given the victory. And he says, you have subdued under me those who rose up against me. So God's brought the enemies under his power, left them in subjection to King David. And I have recalled all this to say that you did it. And I want to extol your name for it. That's what David is saying. I want to give credit where credit is due, because at the point he's writing this, he's no doubt in a kingly robe. Maybe has a diadem on his head and rings on his fingers, holding a scepter, holding court, and negotiating with diplomat. Well, not much negotiating. David tells them, they say, yes, sir, yes, sir. And that's the way it is. But why is it? Because of God, because of the Lord. Because Israel needs to be at peace in their land. What God would have done if the Jews had cooperated was establish his kingdom here among us. You just think about that. He gave covenant to Abraham, and or before that, in the Tower of Babel, they rebelled. Then Moses ultimately comes along. What'd they do? They rebelled. Jesus, John the Baptist, shows up heralding the Messiah, and Jesus comes, and what'd they do? They rebelled. So if man's going to be saved, God's going to have to do it. Because 3 times humanity rebelled against the Lord. And he knew it from the beginning. And so 3 illustrations, so you ought to, in other words, if you're teaching, they ought to have it by now, right? And so God interjects himself. Jesus, John 14, said, when you've seen me, what? You've seen the Father. So he has the mind of God. He has the same sensibilities and all of that. What you can say of one member of the Godhead, you can say of any of them, or all 3 of them. And so God comes and does it for us. But David at this point is doing God's will, and God's with him. In verse 42, so thorough were the victories that it could be said that the enemy was just pulverized. With this very graphic language. Writer here says, well, it's figurative. I don't think so. I think that David was saying exactly what happened in the battles that they were engaged in. Now, you got to remember, who are they fighting? Well, they're fighting people that offer their children up in sacrifice. They're fighting people that are involved in every kind of vulgarity, sexual immorality, and all kinds of stuff. Do that in their religion. And you can just go down the list. Not a bunch of nice people. And God wants them gone so that they won't take his people under and influence them in a bad way. Can God do that? That's right. And they're still having problems. Anytime you don't do what God said to do, that's going to be problematic. Very problematic. So he's, verse 40, he said, you made my enemies turn their backs to me. And probably the enemy, the image there is of complete defeat, and what few survivors left are headed to the hills. I mean, they're headed out of there. Sounds like some fellows in Afghanistan one time that came against some British Royal Marines. There's just a few of them, and they took out half of that enemy force, and the rest of them were last seen running over the ridge, getting out of there. And so it's that kind of a thing, complete and utter devastation. He said, I have destroyed those who hated me. And so his opposition wanted to see him eliminated for personal and national reasons. And so he's in a situation where he's going to act decisively, or he's not going to be here long. And so final was the victory that these heathens end up crying out to the Lord. And what did he say? Well, yeah, sure, come on down. We don't care much. We're real open-minded. Did he do that? Lord didn't answer them. Why? Because they were wicked. And they were pursuing wicked things. And they hadn't repented of it. And so he didn't. They cried to the Lord. They just how desperate they were. At their wits' end, Baal and Ashtaroth and various and sundry other false gods hadn't come to their aid. No doubt they'd call to them. And so now they're calling out to Jehovah. Well, I heard a police chief one time in the cafe, man took the Lord's name in vain out there, and Mr. Benny said, hey, boy, you better call on somebody you know, which was Mr. Benny for you need hush. Don't take that name in vain. Well, here we go. And so he takes care of that, and they're like powder, trampled to where it's just powdered. In verse 43, in addition to all that, God not only delivered David from his enemies, but he exalted him. exalted him by making him the king of Israel. And indeed he can pray, you have delivered me from the contentions of the people. The nation was divided, weren't they? There was a period of time, not everybody just automatically said, oh, it's David, let's crown David. They were ready to crown David after he had demonstrated his ability out there in Sinai as an administrator and as a warrior. You know, it took a period of time. There were detractors. There were other, how that always works in politics. Everybody's kind of jockeying for position and power. And so the Lord intervenes and puts the man, in this case, there that he wants there. And he said that he's emptied the enemies out, just like the muck and mire in the street, to be thrown away. And God exalted him by making him king, and he can pray, you have delivered me from the contentions of the people. And so the divided nation ultimately came together. They realized. And they did pretty well under David, didn't they? Yeah, well, yeah. But overall, they did pretty well and expanded their territory, and they were successful. But then you could see the problems begin to develop and the attitudes begin to shift. But at this point, he has, for 7.5 years, ruled over only one nation, Judah. And now the other tribes have come together under his leadership, 2 Samuel 5, verses 1 to 5. And he says, you have placed me at the head of the nations. It is God who made him king, even though the people placed the crown on his head. He knows it's because of the Lord that he's on that throne. And in addition, God has given him honor beyond Israel. He said, people I don't know serve me. As a king, he's privileged to see other nations come and recognize his authority because he's a great and powerful man. You see at these G7 or G20, what have you, these guys get together, and you can see that delicate, sometimes not so delicate, diplomatic dance takes place, but it becomes pretty evident pretty quick who the big guys are. You get one of those gatherings, it's us and the Russians and the Chinese and the British and the French to some degree, the Germans. You get about 8 or 10 nations, and that's pretty well who's going to decide whatever happens. And that's not new, but in this situation, David has ascended to the place of preeminence, and because they know what he can do in battle. What kind of forces he commands and how they are. And so they just want to get along with him. And that's not a bad thing, is it? If you poke a bear, you're liable to get in trouble, right? And so don't do that. In verse 44, God made him a respected leader among the nations. And he says, as soon as they hear, they obey. They recognize the talent in this man and the ability that he has. And they observe the strength of his nation. And so they want to be united with him. They want to make covenant with him. Other nations behold the greatness of his throne, and with gratefulness, David says, foreigners submit to me. And he's contemplating where he's come from. Who was he? Well, he was the little brother that had to watch the flocks. And the older boys were doing, I guess, more prominent things, because the shepherd job can be kind of lonely out there by yourself with a flock, and you stand between them and whatever becomes a threat to them. And that was good school, wasn't it? And he said, these people now submit to me. Verse 45, impressed by his great strength, the foreigners fade away, it says. They finally come trembling out of their strongholds. They got these towers and fortresses and all that. And David shows up with his flags flying, and they just come on out and put their armor and their weapons at his feet and sue for peace. Because they know if they don't, he's going to come up in that tower after them. And he's going to be successful because his God is with him. Of course, his God is the God. They have not. A lot of the people that he met didn't understand that. Others melt because they just have broken spirits. Their hearts are exhausted from trying to think of ways to overcome him. And so they ultimately just give up, knowing that they can't win, and they decide to bow to his sovereignty. And there again, that's not a bad policy, is it? You know, for one thing, he's going to lead in righteousness. He's doing good things for and of the people. And so why fight against that? That doesn't make good nonsense. People do it a lot, but it's not a very sensible thing to do. Verse 46, he recalls all that God has given him. And that causes him to praise. He said, how did he say it? He said, the Lord lives, and blessed be my rock. Does your Lord live? And is your rock the Lord? Blessed? These words were written to extol the Lord. Is the one behind all of these successes. God is taking his people at this juncture to where he wants them to go. And as long as they were willing to do as he directed them to do, he was with them, right? Told them he would be. And they go along for a while, and then as Brother Aiden observed a while ago, they didn't clean out the land. They, for some strange reason, decided, well, this is enough and we'll be able to handle it. How'd that work out? Just like the Lord said it would. They ended up intermarried among these people. They end up involved in all of the vile practices of heathen paganism. And so right down that rabbit hole they went. Well, there again, I don't care what happens and who says different, the Bible is right. And if a man will walk in the light that he provides, as the Lord's in the light, then he's going to be in a saved state. But it's, we don't tell him, he tells us. And again, we come back to that central truth. Can you trust him? Will you trust him? So when people get into trouble, even good people, Abraham and Sarah got in some difficulty one time, didn't they? God had promised them a son. They decided, well, we hadn't had a son, we have no pregnancy. So here's what we'll do. I'll give you my handmaid Hagar, and any child that she has, I'm going to claim. That wasn't what God intended to do. God was going to give him a flesh and blood heir, and nor did he approve of that whole arrangement. But it was a problem, wasn't it? Still a problem as it reverberates down through the history of the world. And so God is right, whether I always see it or not. There's abundant evidence. David is evidence that God's people did as he'd instructed them, and they prospered. And then when they didn't, he didn't prosper them. How many times do you have to have that lesson? Say, how many times do you have to get into Dutch not doing what you know you need to be doing in order to, as my father used to say, straighten up and fly right? I don't know if you ever heard that phrase. Sometimes he said, boy, you better straighten up and fly right. Now what that meant was there's an immediate correction that better take place, or I will administer some other form of correction that will get your attention. He was a good guy, but he could get hard. Verse 48, for emphasis, he says, he delivers me from my enemies. Then he prays, surely you lift me up above those who rise against me. He's the one, the Lord is the one that subdues all these people. He's the rock. And you think about not a little pebble, but you think about a mighty mountain. That's about the most impenetrable kind of thing that you can think about on this earth. some of those old big mountains have been there a long, long time, and they're still there. And the winds have blown and howled, and the storms have come and gone, and they're still there. And the earthquakes and what have you might have shaken a few boulders off of it, but she's still standing there. And so that's the imagery that he's using. And so he delivers me from my enemies, and he'll lift me above these people. God gives him victory over the enemy. He rescues me from the violent man. Evil, vicious men have sought his life for years, but God enables him to overcome them, and surrounded him ultimately with 600 mighty men. You ought to read about those fellows. I'll tell you right now, if I'd have seen that bunch coming, I'd have just said, "Oop, never mind. I'm out. There's my sword. What's your instructions?" Because they were just an unbeatable force walking in the will of God. And so he reflects on God's care for him. David says that he's never lost a battle, and he's in aggressive pursuit of his adversaries. He's able to overtake them and remove the threat. God acted as his captain in battle, going before him, defeating these opposing forces and armies. He humiliated. They turned their backs and run. And the victories recounted are so complete that it was as if his adversaries had been pounded into dust and blown away by the wind and smashed in the street like mud and trash. God avenged David from the cruel injustices of Saul, and he brought him to the throne of the greatest nation in that whole known world at the time, the nation God had chosen as his nation. And God brought David through the internal divisions of the people that disturbed the early years of his reign, and now has established him firmly as the ruler of a united Israel. And he not only became a respected leader of Israel, but he also became the admiration of the nations. All of those nations round about through the Near Eastern world talked about David. God raised David to a place of international eminence. Foreign nations were subjected to him. And when they heard of his power, the smart ones immediately submitted. And of course, if they submitted and didn't make war, things were going to be fine, right? Others tried to stand against him, but they faded from opposing him like a flower without water or without sunlight, because they soon came out of their strongholds and laid down their armor and their weapons before the conqueror. And having emerged from these experiences, David knows from where that power comes. He knows who has thus empowered him. He knows where his popularity, who is the source of his popularity. And it's not David, it's the Lord. And he knows what he ought to do about it. He is aware that God not only rules him, but also rules in the world, controlling even the destinies of the nations of the earth. And in the heart of David, all glory belongs to God. And he promises to give him that glory by singing praises to his name. Verse 49 and 50. Therefore I will give thanks to you among the nations, O Lord, and I will sing praises to your name. He gives great deliverance to his king and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. So that psalm has now moved through 48 verses of praise. And this is what you'd call a climactic therefore. In other words, he's praised God through these 48 verses of therefore. He comes to this. And because of God's deliverances, because of God's righteous nature, because of God's mighty works and the victories that he's given, David sings praise to the Lord. You know, this country in which we live, you just think about the fortuitous turns of events that we've all benefited from. Well, and I concur. You just cannot have 12, 14 guys get together at a tavern in Boston and decide that they're going to fight the greatest armada that exists at a time when the sun doesn't set on a British flag, if they were quite that dominant, but if they weren't, they were on the way to it. And you look at those things, but you go back and look at the founding documents. We had a series by Dr. Dave Miller where he demonstrated phrases that they'd taken from the King James Bible and that occur all through the founding documents. And they weren't perfect men at all, nor did they claim to be. But they did have a respect for the God of the Bible. And many of them learned to reading the King James Version of the Bible. That's right. And so we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you go on. I mean, they're acknowledging at that point, and we've been blessed. Now we've come to a time where we've murdered about, I think they're up to around 90 million babies. And gone and done some things in the world. I mean, the propaganda here is, we're the good guys. Not always. Yeah. Remove the coins, remove the emblems, remove the statues, try to rewrite history. They've been doing that a long time, haven't they? But here's the positive on that. He has entrusted us with His truth. You say, well, man, we're a bunch mostly retired. We've got 3 young, vigorous people, another pretty vigorous young guy. But overall, you look at our numbers, they're not that great. How numerous does God's force have to be? You got a dynamic, handsome young preacher. If I got to look in the mirror? No, I'm afraid I didn't. But God, Paul wasn't much to look at. The Bible says Jesus wasn't particularly striking in his physical appearance. It wasn't that. It's who He was and what He said and the things that He did. And so He's entrusted us at a critical inflection point in living in the greatest empire in the world at this point. And what are we going to do with that? Say, and what we should be doing with it, what I'm going to keep doing, trying to call people back, try to show them a better way when they're willing to listen. Not going to try to coerce anybody, not going to try to make anybody do anything that they're not willing to do, because God doesn't. If God wanted somebody forced, what? He'd force it. But He's decided that it's got to be a free choice. Man, if he's going to come to Christ, he's got to come because He wants to come and because He wants to submit Himself to the authority of the Lord, because He wants the protection of the rock. And a lot of that protection, the primary part of that protection is spiritual in nature, because we're going to spend a whole lot more time in the spirit realm than we are here. And there again, you can tell people that, and their eyes are kind of glass over, but we're not going to be here long. And a bunch of us, not near as long as we have been. You double your age in how many years that is and see what you think, And that's not to be morbid, but I'm just saying the focus needs to be on what's coming, because that's what's real, and that's what's eternal. That's what lasts. Well, David moves through this, and because of God's deliverances, because of his righteous nature, because of his almighty works, because of the victories he's given, David's going to sing God's praise. And in the first part of this, therefore, he declares, I will give thanks to you among the nations, O Lord. He's not going to confine that to his immediate area. He's going to talk it. He's going to sing it. He's going to broadcast it everywhere. Wherever he goes, he's going to broadcast it. Oh, Lord, I will sing praises to your name, he says. And the implication may be that he hopes the nations, upon hearing his praise of God, will join him in praising the Lord. You know, rather than having to fight people on the field of battle, I think David is like most warriors recognize, it's a whole lot better to get along and to be of one mind and be one people. So there's so much we can accomplish. We've been lucky, not since our own Civil War have we made war on our native soil. But you go back and study, for example, that conflict and see how devastated the country was as a result of that. It's taken over 150 years to get back to some semblance of what it was. It's utterly destructive. Why do that? And so he's wanting these people to join him, I think, probably in praising the Lord. In the verses quoted by Paul in Romans 15, verses 8 through 12, he quotes this part of this passage as the first of four prophecies to show that Christ came to redeem the Gentiles as well as the Jews. And God had always said that he would fold them into his kingdom, and that's good for us. Why? We're all Gentiles. In the Jewish way of thinking, there's Jews and there's Gentiles. And so, from that standpoint, it had nothing to do with ethnicity, but it's a matter of status, spiritually speaking. And so, he's going to bring them in. He said he would. Paul quotes that. And perhaps David thinks that he's simply giving God praise in the words of the psalm. But the Holy Spirit is using those words through Paul to contain a prophecy of the Messiah's praise of God and foretell Jesus bringing the Gentile worshipers into the family of God. And I'm sure glad he did, aren't you? A lot of them, yeah. Well, we all come from the same stock. All that racial superiority stuff is just absurd, you know, and even the geneticists don't tell you that it's all one stock, you know. When you get on back there's one branch, you know, or one trunk to the tree. Of one blood the Lord has made the race. Well, thank you for being with us this morning and looking at the ending part of Psalm 18. If God be willing, we'll next time take up Psalm 19 and maybe even get on over to 20. I thank you for being here.